We're going to have our next session, which will focus on measuring employment and informality. 3 views, surveys, panels, and administrative data. That will be facilitated by Dr. Amina Ebrahim. Dr. Amina Ebrahim will be introducing the panel that they'll be on the stage, and is a research fellow at the UNU-Wider. Please put your hands together and let us all welcome Dr. Amina Ebrahim.
Thank you so much, Busi. And it's really great to be here at this conference and kickstart this session. And if I could ask our esteemed speakers to join me on stage as well, so I'm not here alone, Mr. Joe De Beer, Professor Vimal Ranchhod, and Ms. Mamik Iliulu. So, if I think about public economics, I think about it's fundamentally related to how governments raise revenue, how to allocate spending, and how to evaluate if a policy is working or not. But none of this is possible without data. So in our opening session with our DG and our CG, they gave us a kind of preview of what this looks like. And I believe this session really takes us a little bit deeper. So the question we want to ask in this session really is about how do we know what we know about the South African labor market? And as Lucy said, we have 3 presentations, some presentation about the official labor statistics, information about, or presentation about survey data, panel data, what this can tell us, and then lastly also, and not least, about administrative data. So let me start with our first speaker, Mr. Joe De Beer. Mr. De Beer is a Deputy Director General for Economic Statistics at Stats SA. And he insists I call him Joe, but what did Harun tell us earlier? There's youngers and elders, and we will stick to protocol, shall I say. Over to you.
Right. Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody that I haven't met yet. Thank you very much for the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about Stats SA and what it is that we do in the area of labor market statistics. It's also encouraging to have learned that there are so many students in the audience. So maybe I can, in a way, relate to students in the sense that none of us know what I'm going to say next. And the main reason for that is that I'm trained as a national accountant, and yet today I'm going to speak to you about labor statistics. So the hidden message there is, no matter what you study, 30 years later you're probably going to do a different job. Don't be discouraged. Just keep going. Good basis for what you will need. But let me kick off and see if I can get the technology to work. So let me maybe just start with a slide that talks a little bit about who Stats SA is. For those that are not acquainted, we exist because there's a Statistics Act that gives us the powers to collect statistics, keep it confidential, and a whole raft of other responsibilities. And we try to do our work based on 2 big frameworks. The first is called the African Charter of Statistics, and the second is the Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics. And if you make time to read through these, you will see that it sort of governs the ethics and the way that we should conduct ourselves in the sense of adhering to international best practices, international methodologies, And I will revert back to that a little bit later in the slides. We talked about changes that we've made to our labor statistics to try to measure the informality a bit better. It's in response to what globally happens with international standards and frameworks. As a point of reference, our current mid-year population estimates reckons that we are just over 63 million people in South Africa's population. That was the 2025 ones. And for context, if we look at the economic growth has been quite anemic, if I can say, since COVID. That point was also highlighted by some of the earlier speakers that referenced the high growth rates that we had in the mid to late 2000s. We will also remind ourselves that the period of high economic growth was linked in the build-up to the Soccer World Cup. We had a lot of infrastructure development, the highway projects, the airports, all of these types of things. So there was a lot of infrastructure spending. We saw the dip with the global financial crisis, and then the last excessive dip there was obviously COVID, and then a base effect for the big economic growth. But subsequent to that, if we zoom in a little bit on quarterly numbers, we will see that it's very much an economy that is moving sideways. With here and there, we have a contraction on a quarterly basis. What makes this graph quite interesting is that every quarter when we release the GDP, we also have a press conference and you get interviewed by radio stations and the like, and they would always want to have a nice soundbite about what really happened with the economy. But your problem is if the economy grows at 0.5 and there were 10 different industries, half of them grew by 0.1 or by 0. So it's difficult to make an interesting soundbite out of the economy if really nothing is happening about it compared to when you're growing at 2% or 2.5%. But that's just as a side effect. So let me maybe focus a little bit more on the topic for today, and that is understanding labor market incomes. And I will preface this by saying that Stats SA has two different ways that we talk about labor statistics in general. We have a labor force survey, which we would go to 30,000 households in a panel type of approach where we swap a third of the sample in and out. And we will ask households themselves directly whether they are employed, whether they're unemployed, and all these types of questions. Parallel to that, we have a survey called the Quarterly Employment Survey, which is a firm-based survey. And there we send questionnaires to a lot of different enterprises, and we will ask them information from the firm, how many people are working in your firm. And as we can expect, there are level differences between these two surveys because they come from a different approach. But that reinforces the fact that if you look at something as complex as the labor market, there are many different ways to look at the statistics. And it's important to look at all of them and develop a picture of the labor market rather than being married to a single point estimate that you have. With these being sample surveys, they all come with confidence limits, and we don't have a conference on statistics, but just keep that in mind. There are more than one way to try to measure an economic phenomenon. Having said that, this slide gives us a bit of a history of the Quarterly Labour Force Survey as it is known now. But before many of you in the audience were born, in 1994 we had something called the October Household Survey. Not a very imaginative name, but it was a household survey that we conducted every October. And the idea was to measure service delivery, and as part of that, we also asked questions on employment. After having done the OHS for a few years, we thought, well, maybe we should measure labor a little bit more frequently than just on an annual basis. So we introduced the Labour Force Survey, which ran twice a year at the time, and it was a bit more focused on labor statistics than the October Household Survey. The OHS was then rebranded for those that are interested in service delivery into an instrument called the General Household Survey. So that measures more service delivery issues, and the LFS then focused on the labor market. And then in 2008, following the financial crisis, we introduced the LFS on a quarterly basis, and we started following international standards much more closely. And I will reflect to that a little bit later. Of importance for those two labor surveys is that the firm-based one, which I don't have slides on, the quarterly employment survey, that's a sample survey that is based on our business register, and our business register is informed by VAT registrations and VAT data from SARS. So we draw a sample from all businesses that we deem to be in the formal sector, formal being defined as those that are paying VAT, and that's the sample survey. The QLFS has the advantage, because it goes to households, that it also collects information from people that are not necessarily working in a formal business, and that's why the scope of that survey is a little bit larger. The QLFS sample is derived from a population census. So once you have a population census every 10 years, that allows you to draw what we call a master sample. So from the census results, the methodologist will develop a master sample from which all the household surveys are then sampled, so that can be representative, for example, on a provincial basis, and the like. But let's move a little bit further into the guidelines that we find from the ILO, or in this case, the ICLS. So what happens in practice is global institutions have members from different national statistical offices, and they will debate what new economic phenomenon is happening, whether that's in the economy, whether it's in the labor market, and how do we need to adjust our frameworks, standards, and measurement to pick up on these things that are changing, and what is the best way to measure it. This is sometimes a very tedious process, because it takes a long time for all of us in the ONSs to agree on a definition. You get people from advanced economies, members of OECD, and then you have people from developing countries, or even countries that are in a much less developed state, trying to agree on a similar definition or a similar approach to measure something. And that's not always something that is easy. And once it gets agreed to, well, then you need to start introducing these changes to the survey. So I will be the first to admit that official statistics agencies are not as agile as what we think we should be. It takes us a long time to make changes to surveys. But the fact is, every 5 years, the ICLS comes out with a new set of recommendations. As an example here, we took in 2013, they updated the way we define work, employment, labor underutilization. 5 years later, work relationships. And more recently, in 2023, how informal economy must be measured. And my colleagues that deal with labor statistics have now recently included these definitions into the quarterly labor force, and I will try to explain that a little bit better. So what is the components of the labor market? The new ILO definition says you're employed, that means 50 years and older, you worked for pay, profit, family gain, or you're temporarily absent during the reference week of the survey. Then, if you're not in the blue, the employed, it means you're unemployed. That is, you are without work, actively looking for work, and you could start in that week. If not, then we say you're outside the labor force. You're not employed or unemployed. So 1 and 2 gives us a labor force, 1, 2, and 3 gives us the working age population. Many times the picture works better than the words. So before we implemented the latest resolutions, the left-hand side of the slide shows that Stats SA viewed the working age as people 15 and older, which stayed the same. But we then disaggregated working age into labor force or not economically active. Those were the two options that we had. Within the labor force, you were employed or unemployed. Within the not economically active, you were discouraged. And very often people will then group the discouraged with the unemployed to give you the expanded definition of unemployment, or you were other not economically active. But now with the new ICL, it gives us a bit more scope to have more nuanced labor statistics. And we will all look forward to starting to do this type of analysis as the time series develops and gives us a few more data points. But it now introduces the idea of outside the labor force rather than not economically active, which now we can disaggregate that into a potential labor force or the others. And then the potential one is available but not seeking, or not available but seeking. Now this looks a little bit overwhelming when you start off with, but when we start putting numbers to it, it'll be a little bit more intuitive. This green square just highlights portions of the previous slide, but if we are able to group those together, it'll give us an idea of what labor underutilization is. So we need not always think just about I'm employed or I'm unemployed. I could be employed, but I'm underutilized. And that could be because I'm not working my 40 hours in a week, or maybe I've got an advanced degree in some field, but I might be having an occupation that does not require that. So I'm underemployed or underutilized from that perspective. Now let's put some numbers in. Quarter 1, 2026, working age population, 42.2 million, divided into the two sections. Labor force, 24.9, outside 17.3. Then if we follow the same schematic, employed was 16.8, unemployed 8.1, and now we can see time-related underemployment, 795,000 people. So they're employed, but not necessarily for a full week's worth of work. And on the right-hand side, we can now take the potential labor force that can be disaggregated into discouraged job seekers and the like. So a lot more details and nuances are becoming available in the time series for analysts like yourself to unpack. Just as a longer time frame, we can now map in the red squares the official unemployment rate, 32.7, 8.1 million, and we can also now plot the combined rate of unemployment and the potential labor force that sits obviously a bit higher than this. I will not go through each and every one of these numbers. You will receive the PowerPoints as well if you want to reflect on them. Let us think a little bit more in detail about the last ICLS resolution that we implemented, because that focuses on the informal economy that we know is the theme of the conference. So one of the big changes is definitional. Previously, we identified informal economy, also taking into account the size of the firm. If it was a very small firm, let's say 4 people or less working there, we would say, well, that's an informal one. But now the definitions have changed to only take into account whether the firm is registered or not. So the size is no longer a criterion that we use. And for informal employment, social insurance used to be a key criteria, but now we focus more on whether there's access to paid annual leave, paid sick leave, to give you an idea of this is more like a formal job that you have, but more regulated, although regulated is maybe not completely the correct word in this essence. This slide tries to compare the old and the new standard. You will see that the numbers at the bottom do not change that much. It's because from one quarter to the next, movements tend to be quite small, so the differences are just on the second decimal, if I can put it that way. The overall picture stays the same. Formal sector, 12.2, new definition, 12.1, 3.5 stays the same. But let me keep going and talk a little bit more about the youth, as that is the theme for today. If we use the same schematic, now the working age population, and we define youth as being 15 to 34, is 21 million, 10.3 in the labor force, 10.6 outside. Of the 10.3, we can see the split 5.6 and 4.7. Discouraged work seekers on the grey side towards the bottom, just 2 million. Now 2 million out of the 3.9 were young people in the first quarter, but we can see if you take the youth, it's nearly the same number as the adults, but 15 to 34 compared to 35 to 64. So that also has a picture by itself if you start analyzing it that way. Again, focusing on the youth, the same slide as what we had previously, but this time just for the 15 to 34 year cohort, we can see that there's quite a large difference between the unemployment rates, whether you're older or whether you're part of the youth. This one breaks it up into more age cohorts. So if you're my age, you will see that the unemployment rate is 12.6%, absorption 38.9%. As we get to younger groups, 15 to 24, sitting with unemployment rate of 60.9%. And we can see that the pyramid goes bigger, the younger that you become. Obviously, when you look at numbers, the more detailed you have it, the easier it is to understand it or to want to make a policy intervention. So we can unpack the numbers by province. And here we can see, if we compare unemployment rate with the labour force participation rate, there are huge differences across the provinces. It is not a single number that can define the country. You really need to look at the numbers for the province where you want to make specific interventions. Just look at the differences that we, for example, see on the left-hand side of this slide. The unemployment rate in Western Cape, 28.7. Labour force participation is 62. But the numbers are the other way around if we go to Northwest and the Eastern Cape, where the grey and the red changes their slides. A lot of the youth between 15 and 24 are, of course, busy with education or training, so we need to take into account. They might be willing to work, would be available if a job opportunity came up, but you're still at school. So you're not part there, so we also need to separate that are employed or in education and training, and we can see the numbers there. That one flattens out as the working population gets older because we tend to stop studying as we get older. Never stop learning, but you maybe stop studying formally. The overall rates, we can see the differences, 0.5 percentage point, but unless you're really an expert in labour statistics, as many of you are, it's really flat lines, those lines. So they're just horizontal. There's no real increase or decrease in those lines. Which industries can we assign this to? So for the youth, occupation or industry where they're most active, community and social services, then finance. Finance here is a bit of a misleading term. If you look at our industry classification, that sector or industry is actually called finance, financial intermediation, real estate and business services, which is more than 20% of the economy, but we tend to abbreviate it as finance in the slides and everybody thinks, oh, it's the banks. But it's not, it's all the business services that are included there. And what types of work do they do? It starts at the bottom. Elementary work, 25%, sales and services, which means that the youth typically will then be employed in those industries where you do not necessarily need very high academic skills or technical skills. You go for the skills that are elementary or in sales or clerical. We have another survey that runs as a two-parter with the quarterly labour force survey. So if in the QLFS you indicate that you are by your own admission in the informal sector, but you have a sideline business, we then say, okay, let us send you a follow-up questionnaire, which we call the survey of employers and self-employed, because you might have your own business, to give us an idea of what was previously called the informal sector and the economic contribution of that to the GDP, which is a little bit more in my space. So we conduct it every 4 years. It's fairly pricey to do these household surveys. So we do a follow-up questionnaire. And unfortunately, the last time we did this in 2023, we still had the old ICLS definitions, not the new ones. So we will look forward to the next iteration of the CSF, because then the informal sector and informal employment will be measured according to what the QLFS does now. At the moment, it's not strictly comparable. But it asked us, still has some information that is very relevant. So in this case, we ask questions that are running at least one business, but non-VAT registered. Because remember, we said if you registered for VAT, you will be in our sample for the firm-based survey. So all of these are non-VAT registered. And we ask, what's the reason for starting this informal business? And more than half, nearly, 60% said, well, I don't have an alternative income source. So I need to do something to earn money. Very few, maybe 10%, although it's the second most important, says I have the skills of this business. A couple were retrenched. The other category stayed fairly similar. So 1.9 million South Africans did this in 2023, which is a huge increase from 1.5 million 10 years earlier. And now think back of the graph that we showed on the economic growth. the economy is going sideways, but people still need to make a living, they're going to start doing more and more of their own thing to start earning the money. So this is not a surprising issue. Gender is also interesting to look at. It was mostly dominated by females in 2001 when we did the survey the first time. Maybe 2/3, 1/3, or was it about 60-40? But now the ratio swapped around a little bit. There might be a story behind that. If we do the comparisons over age, now we took it back to 2001 to 2023, whether it is middle age, 35 to 44, or slightly older. You can see the comparisons there, whether the activity here has declined or not. Keep in mind that over this 20-year period, you can also have people that were reported in 2001 in one of the age groups moving along the statistics, if they stayed in it. Which industries did people do their own businesses? Mostly traders. Anecdotally, that makes sense because that is what you see. We see hawkers. The keynote speaker, the Prof, made the point about how difficult it is to find your 5 square meters in Camps Bay to become a trader, but it's still the most popular activity. Maybe it's the easiest one, just buy and sell, things that you can do. Community and social services increased a lot, 6.8% to 14.8%, nearly doubled. Included there will be personal services, which will be the hairdressers, people doing nails, this type of thing, which has a relatively low barrier of entry to provide that sort of a personal service. What was the assistance that these informal business owners required? Top of the reasons given was assistance with marketing, and that also increased the most over this 20-year period. Provision of an alternative site talks back to the previous study that was shown. People don't have space to do things, so the statistics at least backs that up. Finance is, I guess, always a bit of an issue. Government regulations came in relatively low. Maybe that's because people don't really know about the regulations, or that maybe don't care. They just go and do the business. 9 out of 10 did not have licenses, which maybe speaks to the previous point. People didn't rank government regulations as a key issue that they need support with, because 9 out of 10 just said, okay, well, I'm just going to go on with this. Now, my last slide maybe just tries to link it to the policy angle of this 3-day conference, and that is, if you do not use the statistics that we have, and I'm not by any means saying that the surveys from Stats SA is beyond reproach. There are many different ways to unpack the labor market, but if you do not use any of these statistics, then you run the risk of just using anecdotes. You might be influenced in your policy formulation by power groups, people that have their own agendas to influence policy in a specific way. So I guess the key message is for this audience, when we think about solutions, make sure that you tie it to some sort of statistic to back you up, because then, as the chair of the session said, afterwards you'll be able to monitor the effectiveness of this policy intervention with monitoring evaluation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. De Beer. Next up, our second speaker, Professor Vimal Ranchhod. He's the director of the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. The stage is yours.
Can I give you my mic?
Okay, I'll use this. Yeah? Thank you for having me, and thanks for inviting me to speak about NIDS and NIDS CRAM. I'm going to talk a little bit about it in the sense of the history of the project, and then end up with some of the cool research that has come out from it. Okay, so as my colleague from StatsSA talked about, we have lots of data on labor markets. We have the QLFS, which has been running for about 20 years now. And before that, there was the LFS, and before that, there was the OHS. And these are incredible national statistics, right? NIDS is similar in that it's a survey. It's most similar to StatsSA's GHS in the sense that it has several modules, and it's not just a labor force survey. But it's not that different insofar as the data we designed the questionnaire alongside the best practices of the time, right? So I'm going to talk about what they are, and then particularly what makes it different, because it's a longitudinal data set or a panel data set. We've heard Harun talk about these things. We've heard Duncan talk about it a little bit. And in particular, there's certain types of analyses that you can do with panel data which are impossible or very hard to do credibly with cross-sectional data. So just to clarify the terms, the QLFS, the QES, the OHSs, the LFSs, those are all cross-sectional data sets. And they do actually have a temporal structure in them. I might talk about that a little bit, but they're not designed as longitudinal data sets, right? Whereas NIDS from its inception was designed as a person-level panel set data set. And I'm going to try to hopefully convince you that that enables you to do some cool things. All right, let's jump in. So longitudinal data sets, which are also called panel data, it's the same thing literally, is any data where the unit of observation or the object of interest that we're going to interview or gather data on is measured repeatedly over time, right? So as an analogy, think of a cross-section as a photograph and a panel study as a movie or a very slow-moving movie, yeah? And most of the time, and certainly for NIDS, it's true, our things are individuals or households because we're interested in socio-economic phenomena. But there are lots of other things that you could have, and for example, the QAS would often go back to the same firms because there'll be some entry and exit, but there'll be a lot of repeated firms. And so it has some element of a longitudinal component. And we're going to hear later on about the SARS-NT dataset, and that one will have a panel structure for firms and for individuals insofar as they appear repeatedly over years. Yeah? We can also do longitudinal studies on areas or administrative units like municipalities, provinces, countries, etc. And in particular, the way we actually do use it as labor economists, the StatsSA ones, both the GHS and the QLFS have what is called a dwelling level panel component, meaning it's a bit complicated, but the GHSs at several points go to the same dwellings, the same physical households, not necessarily the same family, the same address, right? And insofar as people have not moved, you can extract longitudinal data from there. Similarly with the QLFS, that one has a rotational panel design. It's all going to change. Someone else from StatsSA can tell us about the new designs. But the point is, there are overlapping panel structures in the QLFS. Okay. So NIDS, what is NIDS? NIDS is an acronym for the National Income Dynamic Study. We started it in 2008, where our data collection for wave 1 happened, and the last wave, there were 5 waves, happened in 2017. It was a project initiated by the presidency, and my research unit, SALDRU, was the implementing entity. So the data, together with the accompanying documentation, is available from Data First at UCT. This is a fantastic data archive. For anyone who's thinking about doing an empirical thesis or research, they've curated pretty much all the publicly available data in the country. Well, except for the NT-SARS data, you have to come to Pretoria for that. So we had about 9,000 households with close to 30,000 respondents in wave 1. And it just grew and grew and grew because it's an individual panel. So unlike, for example, the QLFS panel or the GHS panel, in NIDS, if someone moves, like you grow up, you move to Joburg to get a job, or you get married and start your own family, will then follow both households, or both sets of people. And so over 5 waves, the NIDS sample grew almost exponentially. And that's something that is really unique to NIDS compared to the other sources of information. It also has information on demographics, health, education, labor markets, earnings, income, and then in some waves we added certain special modules. So for example, there's a wealth module in waves 2, 4, and 5. And so depending on what you're interested in, you need to go carefully through the questionnaires and figure out what you can do. But the other thing that's really valuable about NIDS is that because it's got this broad structure, you can ask questions about how people's labor market outcomes impact on their health. Right? The QLFS is very focused. It's a labor force survey, whereas this one allows you to think about things in a much more complex and interrelated manner. So NIDS-CRAM. NIDS-CRAM is an acronym for the National Income Dynamics Study, Coronavirus Rapid Mobile Study. So I had to Google what it meant, and I was one of the people who led it. So this is a fascinating micro study or special study. What happened was, it was March of 2020, and we got that announcement that in a week's time, everyone's going to have to stay at home, and that's the end. Well, who knows for how long, right? Well, first it was 3 weeks, then it became 5 weeks, and nobody could go to work. And so a group of people, including from WITS, from Stellenbosch, from UCT SALDRU, got together and designed a rapid study, which we did telephonically. That's what I say somewhere, CATI. CATI stands for Computer Assisted Telephonic Interviews. So it's very different in structure to the previous waves of NIDS, which for the most part were CAP PEC, where we went into people's households to talk to them. But because it was lockdown, you couldn't. It forced us rapidly to transition to a different medium of interview, and that does change a little bit what you can ask and also the types of responses you're likely to get. Yeah? But it was an incredibly valuable data set because it was a time when, you know, nobody knew what was happening. We knew things were not going to be great. We knew things were changing rapidly, but we had no information. And certainly not information that was going to come with a high enough frequency to be useful. And so it was called NIDS-CRAM because we actually just drew, with permission from the presidency, we drew a sample out of the NIDS sample. Right? So the people in NIDS-CRAM are the same people from NIDS. It's a subset, though. We only got a much smaller subset. But you can link them back through the 5 waves of NIDS into NIDS-CRAM. And that allows you to do a lot more, again, in terms of kind of thinking of long-run trajectories and then what happened during the COVID era. Yeah? Okay, so I'm going to try to make the case why longitudinal data is sometimes much better than cross-sectional data. Not always, to be precise, but sometimes it does things you just can't do otherwise. So the first thing is that all longitudinal data can be analyzed in the same way that you analyze cross-sectional data. You can just kind of pretend that your wave is a cross-section and ignore the other waves and the temporal structure to it, right? And so you'll never lose anything by doing that. But there's 2 particular types of analyses which you can do with longitudinal data which you can't do with cross-sectional data. The first is that you can look at dynamics. You can look at how people find jobs, how people lose jobs, which people find jobs. You can look at how the people who stayed longer in school eventually maybe get better jobs, which is one of the things Harun was talking about earlier. The other thing is there's a branch of econometrics which is called panel data methods, where you can sometimes correct for certain types of biases in your regression analysis using panel methods, which you can't do with a cross-section. You just can't do it. I'm not going to talk about the second one because we'd have to have a whole course on this. And also, I think the first one is probably more of a valuable thing when you're thinking of a lot of policy questions. So why do we want data? Let's just go back to that. We want data sometimes for planning purposes because we need to know how many people they are, or how many people they are who need a grant, or how many people are in school, etc. And on the other side, sometimes we want to know whether what we've tried has worked or could be working better, or should we try something else, right? So policy evaluation, those are two of the big things that you could do, which I'm imagining policymakers would find as a very useful thing. So I want to give a very, very simple example that will highlight, hopefully, the difference between the cross-sectional and the panel approach. So let's suppose I have a population of 100, right? And I'm thinking about the incidence of sickness. So in my population, I've got a hospital, and every week, 9 people get a flu, and 1 person gets COVID, right? COVID is more severe. The people with the flu have to go to hospital for a week, and then they get discharged. The person with COVID goes to hospital for 2 weeks and then gets discharged, okay? In the first week, I'll go to the hospital and I'll see there's 9 flu people and 1 COVID patient. In the second week, the first 9 flu patients have been discharged, but there's a new 9, because every week this is happening. There's 1 pre-existing COVID patient, because they're going to stay for 2 weeks. And there's 1 new COVID patient, right? Yeah? So the point is that from week 2 onwards, in steady state, I'm going to see that pattern. There'll always be a ratio of 9 flu patients to 2 COVID patients. 9 flu who came for a week, 1 new COVID patient, and 1 pre-existing COVID patient, right? And so my incidence, my rate of infection is 9 to 1 in my population, right? But my data, if I use the cross-section of the hospital, is going to be a ratio of 9 to 2. This is called duration bias in the econometric sense. And why would it be relevant? It just depends. If I'm the hospital manager and I'm thinking about beds and supplies and materials, then I should use the 9 to 2 ratio, because that's what I'm dealing with, right? But if I'm thinking about a public health intervention that will, like a vaccine, which will slow down rates, then my planning should be on the 9 to 1 ratio, right? So it depends on the question of interest and the types of policies that you might be thinking about. Yeah? So trying to make this story more relevant to labor markets, what we'll find is that a lot of labor market policies and interventions are about flows. They're about job finding rates. How do we help young people find jobs? How do we help people not lose jobs? How do we find stable jobs instead of precarious jobs, right? And the dynamics are the important thing, first of all, in the sense that the policies are targeting dynamics. So if you think of your employment tax incentive, that's designed to help people find their first jobs, or at least young people find the jobs, right? But the second thing is, some policies will take so long before we can make a call if we just look at the levels rather than the flows. The flows are fast, they're sensitive. But the levels, it can be a very slow moving process before you'll be able to see the levels are not moving the way we wanted them to. Right? So the temporal speed with which you can make an evaluative call and correct or adjust or go bigger if necessary it's just more sensitive on the flows. Right? And for example, this is just a hypothetical, but there are questions about this when we're thinking of informal sectors. Is the informal sector a stepping stone? Does it facilitate the acquisition of skills and expertise and social networks that help you get better, more stable jobs? Or is it a sinkhole? Is it the type of thing that once you do that, that's what you're going to be doing? And you could even have, scenarios where it can be an intergenerational place. Like people start that and that's a family business and that's where they stay. So that's an important question, right? It's kind of a big deal even when you think of the type of stuff Haruna is talking about when you're thinking, on the other hand, of the dynamic welfare implications. And you really wouldn't be able to see that in a cross-section, because a cross-section is just going to tell you the percentages, the percentage in informal, the percentage in formal, the percentage unemployed. All right, so I want to just share a few examples, and very simply, because there's lots of research, and I also think there's lots more that can and should be done using this data. So this is by Miracle Ben-Hura and Prudence Maheo from WITS, and they were part of the NIDSCRAM team. It was, like I said, a group of us that did all this work, but they focused specifically on what happened to workers in the formal sector and the informal sector, because if you recall, we had the hard lockdowns for about 5 weeks. Like, people weren't allowed to leave their homes, which meant that a lot of the street trader people and a lot of service sector, service workers in the informal sector weren't allowed to go to work, right? And then slowly the regulations relaxed, and then we got the stage 5 or 4 or 3, etc. But what they wanted to look at was by sector, informal sector or formal sector, what happened to the wage distribution. Okay, and the blue line is the wave 1. Wave 1 was April 2020. I'm sorry, I didn't copy everything, but wave 1 is April 2020, and the dashed orange line is July. So it's a short span of time, yeah? And what happened between wave 1 and wave 2 is we saw in both distributions, the wage distribution just shrinks. And that's because a lot of people were not working or went into unemployment, yeah? Or they had to work fewer hours. But what you can hopefully visually see, and I did share the paper where they're far more thorough and precise about things, what you can see visually is that the gap between the blue and the orange is much, much bigger in the informal sector than for formal sector workers. And this was something that a few people had established with time, that informal sector workers were far more precarious to lockdowns, right? They bore a disproportionate brunt. So informal sector workers on average earn much less to begin with, but then they also took bigger percentage-wise declines in their wages during COVID. And you wouldn't be able to see this without longitudinal data. The second one is also on the informal sector. It's by Mike Rogan, who's at Rhodes, and Carolyn Skinner at UCT. And they also did a similar paper, well, in the sense that they were asking what happened to informal sector workers, and specifically, though, they were interested in gender differentials in the informal sector, right? So this text is very small. I need to be careful so I don't fall off the stage. But here they're asking, what is the percentage drop in hours worked conditional on being in informal sector employment during COVID, right? And there's 3 categories here: self-employed, employees in informal sector enterprises, and casual workers. And what you found was that employees had a 10 percentage point decline, but self-employed workers, which are the ones who Harun was mostly talking about earlier, have a more than 50% decline in hours worked during the COVID period. And the same was true for casual workers, they're at 50%. So there was significant heterogeneity in the impact of COVID and the lockdowns on different types of informal workers. The other thing which they focus on is gender differences. And this bar is women, and this bar is men. And the men, all of them who were employed in the informal sector to begin with, right? So you're conditioning on informal sector employment. The men have a 25 percentage point decline. And the women have an almost 50%, it's 48.6%. So women were twice, or experienced a decline in hours that was twice in proportion terms what the men experienced. And so these are really interesting, important distributional issues, right? When you've got these big shocks, and also you're thinking what happened after that. Was one of the things that came out exposed was the SRD, right? This was a motivating factor, that you had lots of people who were under extreme duress. And it's worth thinking about these distributional things, but again, we wouldn't have been able to do it without longitudinal data. This is the last slide, and it's just self-promotion. It's by my colleague Cecil Macheni and myself, and we were looking at youth unemployment and youth flows across different labor market states. And now we're thinking of NIDS Wave 1, 2, and 3, right? So it's an old paper. Why I wanted to include it is because, well, we can see, first of all, if we just look by rural and urban, we'll see, and we started, okay, let me explain, sorry. We started with youth aged 16 to 20 in wave 1. And we just ask the empirical question, what were they doing or where were they in wave 2 and wave 3? So wave 1 was 2008, wave 2 was 2010, 2011, and then the next one was, I think, 2013. Yeah? So as they age out of the schooling system and enter into the labor market, right? And we find that, for example, the employment rate for rural youth as they go into wave 2 and wave 3, it goes up, and it's quite similar actually. Rural youth and urban youth have a 20% employment rate after 2 waves, conditioned on being in rural or urban in wave 1. But what was really interesting for myself and Cecil is when we explored, okay, so then we asked, how much does migration play? And again, you have to follow people across time and space if you want to think about migration studies, right? We asked, how much of a role does migration play for youth who are finding jobs? That's a simple question. Very few of the youth from urban areas are moving into rural areas when they're finishing school and aging in their early 20s. But it's a non-trivial share of the rural youth who migrate, right? And I just want to focus on this here, that if we look at the rural-urban non-migrants, this is by wave 3, the employment rate is 18.5%, right? And the NEET rate, the not in education, enrollment, or training, and employment, enrollment, or training, is 51%. So half of them are not in the labor force and not in schooling. But for the ones who migrated to an urban area, this employment rate is 39%. It's double. So migration is a really important mechanism through which, at least on a descriptive level, through which rural youth are able to successfully enter the labor force. And then that's a big deal, because what does it mean both for spatial inequalities, but also for how you might try to facilitate and empower youth to successfully transition into the labor market? Right? I think I'm done. Yeah, okay. So just to close out, panel data and individual panel data in particular for labor economists enables us to investigate some really important and interesting socioeconomic issues. The data is available for free download, and I encourage all the graduate students to think about using it. I think it's a fantastic data set, and it's underutilized. There's still so many more interesting and cool papers to be written. It also has, I circulated one other paper which is very new. It came out 2 weeks ago, I think, by Kumalo et al. The et al. Is Berger and Van Vintel in the Journal of Development Economics. And what they did was, just to give an example, is they look at the child support grant, and the object of interest, the outcome space, is adolescent mental health. And you know, the child support grant was introduced in the late 90s, but first it was only for children aged 0 to 7. And then slowly the age range got wider and wider and wider. And so they used this variation in the extensions to identify people who just could have got it, or just got excluded. And they used that to figure out a measure of how much the grant helps protect against mental health issues. Now, this is a big deal, because if you're thinking, this is one of our biggest public safety, social security mechanisms. It's the old age pension and the child support grant. But you want to know that it's working, that it's doing a good job, it's helping. And if just the threat of not getting it is changing people's mental health, that's a clear sign, right? So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ranchhod. So just to recall, we have an online audience, and after our last speaker, we will have open up for some questions and answers. And in case you are interested in the speakers and their bios and their histories and a little bit more about their work, actually within the Join app, you'll see a little gray box that says speaker bio. So you click that one, it'll open you up to a PDF with all our information. So last but not least, let me introduce you to Mamiki Liulu. Mamiki is the business area head of macroeconomic Research Unit in the Compliance and Revenue Division at SARS. Over to you, Mameki.
Thank you. I hope you're not going to say typical woman carrying so many things. So, good morning, everybody. I thought maybe I could give a bit of a context to my presentation and check whether you've got this publication on your tables. Yes, thank you. So earlier on, you would have heard the DG of National Treasury talk about the Mzansi Data Exchange Lake. And this is where all of the data of all the government departments are supposed to be pooled in a coordinated fashion. Preceding the thoughts and the activities around Mzansi Exchange would have been the work of, do I need to carry a mic? Yes. Got it, thank you. Preceding that, we had work, which is still currently running with the National Policy Data Observatory. Again, putting together data from various institutions to help with decision-making, empirical-driven decision-making. Preceding that, a project called the SEAD project, the Social Economic Activity Data. Again, you can Google that. This is the work that has been done, putting some of the information that is available from SARS, anonymized data, adding on to it the layer of municipal data, local municipalities and metro municipalities to allow for also again data-backed decision-making. Preceding that was the data lab that both our Commissioner of SARS and the DG spoke about, where we do have a data facility, a secure data facility, and SARS's anonymized data serves as the base, and there's been other data points, but data set from SARS, anonymized data set from SARS is used as a base. But the baby that has started all of this is the tax statistics, which I hope you all have a copy on your desks. And if I can invite you to just open the publication, because I'm going to walk you through some of the findings and some of the key insights that we see as a tax administration authority. So we may not necessarily be in the obvious realm of Stats SA, of collating big statistics, but we do, as my leaders have already indicated before, that it's not even a byproduct, but a product of the work that we do is we do generate a lot of data, and that data allows us to make more informed, more rich decisions. And so, as you see on the screen, we do have a presentation that we would like to walk you through that speaks of the statistics and the data that we see as the tax administrator. I must click. Okay. So in the program, you would have seen the words PIT, the words UIF being made reference to. We do collect many tax revenues, and you see at the top their tax revenue being the primary portion of our collections, and it accounts for about 90% of South Africa's overall revenue bucket. We do also collect non-tax revenue on behalf of other departments. So non-tax revenue would include the mining, petroleum, and resource royalties. We collect, you see at the bottom there, Unemployment Insurance Fund on behalf of the Department of Labor, the Road Accident Fund, etc., etc. And some of the collections that we do administer or assist with has some administrative data associated with it, and some not. So today's presentation tries to just give you a sense of the landscape and the lay of the land for SARS. In the year that we've just concluded, 2025-26, we collected around 2 trillion rands. And I think people do make fun in SARS around how many zeros those are in the 2 trillion rand, but be that as it may, in that 2 trillion rand, we collected almost 794 billion with a B of pay-as-you-earn. 767 billion of pay-as-you-earn. Why I'm mentioning pay-as-you-earn is that normally you'd also start asking questions about SDL. SDL, we collected almost 26 billion, so it's quite a big difference there. And the next question that will be asked will be UIF. UIF, we collected close to about 27 billion. That is the year that we just concluded. On the screen that you see is data relating to, obviously, some of the non-tax revenue, SACU payments, consolidated revenue that we're also a part of. In the screen that you see, it just gives a quick overview of the various tax products that we administer and collect on. The first column talks of the taxes on income and profit, and you see right at the bottom there, pay-as-you-earn being one of the big contributors to our revenue collections. If you scroll your eyes to the next data column, that's SDL, that's the skills development levy that we collect on the payroll and workforce taxes. And if you move your eyes right across to the other end of the screen, you'll see non-tax revenue that I've mentioned we collect on, MPRR, Road Accident Fund, and UIF. Now, in the tax statistics publication, this is now chapter 1 that I've just walked you through. Chapter 2 is the information where we start combining a couple of things. We look at tax revenues of registered individuals. We look at information by taxable income, by age, by gender, by municipality, by as well as sources of income, fringe benefits, allowances, and deductions. And at the bottom of the slide that I'm presenting today is just a summary of the data that we see from what we call the micro-simulation model of PIT mod. So those of you who don't want to be left behind in terms of the discussions, if you then go right at the bottom there, pages 70 to 75 of our publication, it will give you just a summary of the data that we are picking up and analyzing and constantly tracking as the tax authority. Again, this is a more of descriptive statistics rather than more sophisticated modeling per se. So what does the PIT mod help us understand? And the second bullet point, it applies PIT rules to millions of anonymized taxpayer records, and we analyze and evaluate the distributional impact of proposed tax policy changes, but more importantly and more relevant for today's session is that we produce tax statistics from that model. What are the sources of data that we look at? In the next bullet point, the information submitted by the employers in terms of IRP5, IT3A certificates, tax returns submitted by individuals, third-party information submitted by external parties, and we then use that to analyze what are the sources of income, deductions, taxable income, and tax credits. You may ask yourself, Mamiki, why are we then talking about this today when our key topic and theme is around unemployed youth? Sometimes we also have to look at the other side of the equation. When youth get employed, where are they employed? How are they employed? In which sectors are they employed? So that when we also have conversations about dealing with the observations about the unemployed, we also have a good sense of observations about those that find themselves in the employed space. So the first data point that I would like to raise, that you can also see on table 82.11.13, right, towards the end part of chapter 2, just gives a sense of all the individuals that we look at in our PIT mod. There's about 14.2 million individuals that we look at. About 84% of those are younger than 55 years. About 56% are between 26 and 45. And in the highlighted bullet point, the youth category, 15 to 34, contributing to about 43%. There's about 6.4 million of them. In terms of taxable income and tax liability of the overall group, there's about 3.3 trillion of taxable income and 620 billion of tax liability raised. And you see in the yellow highlighted, the youth category contributed about 25%. So 43% in terms of count, but 25% in terms of contributing to taxable income and 17% contribution towards tax liability. The last bullet point also just highlights the intersectionality of conversations that we have around youth issues as well as gender issues. Table 82.11.1 talks about the aggregate income sources. So where do they earn their income from? And again, if you look at the table, we do give a long list of sources of income. So other than salaries, other than annual payment bonuses, fringe benefits, there's a whole long list that also allows you to start looking at different sources. How do they change over time? So the youth category, you'd see that for them, unlike everybody else, the rest of the population of 14 million, the youth category's contribution of salaries, the source of income with regards to salaries and wages, that's about 80%. If you then look at the next two categories, fringe benefits and annual payment bonuses, that's close to about 15%. Giving a cumulative of 95%. Why this is important is that if you then take the same table, table 82.11, if you compare the overall aggregate sources for all the 14 million individuals, we've taken a slice out and looked at particularly the youth, the category 15 to 34 years. And if you take a look at the contribution to some of the aligned items there, things like director's fees, very few, or there's very little that you see that's being collected or taxed for director's fees, because that category of 15 to 34 are most likely not going to find themselves earning director's fees as a main source of income. So it also starts to allow to understand and unpack what the sources of income are. The table that I've just highlighted there is just, again, for those of you who aren't always keen to read words, if you see it in a table format, that table 82.11.13, you see the areas that are shaded in green, so not green.
Gray.
Thank you, gray. Shaded in gray, 16 to 20, all the way to 31 to 25. You see the number of taxpayers there. Most of the youth bunching towards the age group of 26 to 30, overall contributing about 17.6% of overall share. That particular grouping, again, being a big contributor in terms of taxable income and tax liability. So if we had to also look at the sector distribution, again, we asked the team to just select for us those that are in the income grouping 16 to 35, in which sectors most are they sitting under. Sorry, we've already dealt with this one. Which sectors, again, I think confirming the earlier point that was made by Dr. De Beer from SSA around the big contribution sectors would look at or seem like it is in the financial intermediation, insurance, real estate, and business services, also known as the finance sector. So you see there, in the last column, 2024-25, that's the data that's got 316 billion as the pay-as-you-earn, that's payments received from employees that are sitting with employers in that sector. So again, it just gives you a sense of where do we see our distribution patterns tilting towards. The same table, if you then look at overall assessed individuals, it will give you the same kind of picture, same picture that Stats SA has given in terms of sector dynamics. For those of you who would want to take this study further, so what you're seeing right now is a snapshot of the past 5 years. If you go to our website, and I know that some of you, when you look at the QR code here, you think that it's just for play. If you scan this QR code, I know you already scanned another QR code for Vusi and the program director, but also our QR code, if you scan there, you'd actually see the entire library of our tech statistics. The first, which was published in 2008, so in 2008 it already contained data of the past 5 years. So those of you who'd want to take much long-term view panel data, you can use that to conduct your research and your studies and to also understand and see how our labor dynamics have changed over this period. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mamiki, for the really interesting statistics shared. I think I'm going to move this side and then kickstart the discussion. Oh, thank you. So maybe I'm going to start with a question for the panel. I'm going to take the liberty as the facilitator of the session to ask a question. All the same question, to push a little bit some of the thinking, I think. So the Director General is not in the room from the National Treasury, but if he were to give you a budget, think about a check without any specific numbers. What is the one major improvement to data about the South African labor market that you would make? So what is the one big improvement that you would think about or you want to implement if the resources were unlimited? Another way to think about this is, in your view, from the Stats Authority, from our survey work, from the tax administration, what is the biggest data gap you think we have with regards to the labor market? It's also okay to say that we don't have any gaps, but yeah. Mr. De Beer, shall we?
Yeah, I see I only have 24 minutes to answer this one.
3 minutes for you.
Yeah, I think as an economist, the more granular your data is, the more useful the data becomes. So I would highlight 2 areas of improvement. The one is already addressed by National Treasury in terms of funding, and that is our continuous population survey, sort of how we want to improve the QLFS to make the statistics available on a district level. I think if you can understand the labor market at a district level rather than just at a provincial level, it already increases the usefulness a lot. The second improvement I would want to make, which is not funded, is for South Africa to introduce the latest industry classification. At the moment, we disaggregate the economy based on an industrial classification that came out in the early 90s. And the problem with that is a lot of the emerging economic activities, such as e-hailing, a lot of the things that came with computers, digital economy, we don't acknowledge that separately in our statistics, whether it's labor market or the GDP, which makes it difficult for policymakers to know where to intervene because we group everything under something called business services rather than being very detailed about where this happens. So I would highlight those two items. Thank you.
Professor Ranchhod.
Thanks, Dr. Ebrahim. So I am biased, of course, but I think the one thing we don't have anymore, like I was saying, NIDS ended in 2017, and then NIDS CRAM was a very peculiar, precise thing for a moment in time. But we don't, at this moment, have longitudinal labor market data for the whole system. So the SARS-NT data set will give you longitudinal data for the people who maintain formal employment. It won't cover people in informal employment unless those people still somehow get an IRP5 form. The Stats SA panels, which you can extract from the QLFS or the GHS, like I said, they're dwelling level panels. And what we know from lots of other studies, including NIDS, is that people move for jobs. People move cities, people move back home to wherever home means. When they lose jobs, people move when they retire. And what that means is that any of the dwelling level panels, I have one of my PhD students working on this right now, it really underestimates some of the dynamism because it's anchoring on a physical dwelling. And so all the people who migrate in response to or in anticipation of an employment shift are not getting captured in those ones. And so I think it's almost like that margin, which I think is still important in South Africa, especially given our historical spatial distributions of people and overlaid with economic activities, it's just kind of lost, actually.
Thank you so much. Mamiki, blank check.
Blank check. Me, if just asking from my perspective, would probably be real-time dynamic data. That's something that we always wish we could access. But on behalf of SARS, we've got 8 generational projects that we're pursuing to be achieved by 2030. One of them is the unique identity. Typical South African is probably around 7 identities. The national identity from Home Affairs, identity number for SASSA, identity number for different institutions. And that creates many, many opportunities for not only on the data side, but also on the administration side, but also on the abuse side, double dipping, people earning salaries and also getting grants, etc. So the unique identity would probably be something that we would wish to get funding for and get expedient implementation on. Thanks.
Thank you so much for indulging my quick experiment. So now to open up to the floor. So we've had really great presentations delving deep into the discussion on data. I see one hand at the back. Vusi, I'm going to ask if you can check for questions online. Some more questions further in the front from the fairer sex. Okay, we'll take the first one at the back. So I think we'll do a round of 3 or 4 questions and then we'll see if we can take answers. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Good day, everyone. My name is Kamogelo Modise. I am from the National Treasury. I just have one question. It's referring to tax incentives. So I am aware that the employment tax incentive for youth has been implemented, but the uptake, rather, it is somewhat debated. So I just want to ask if this policy has somewhat subsidized employers who would have hired anyway, or does evidence show that meaningful net job creation for young people, and should it be dramatically expanded or stopped? Thanks.
Excellent question.
Good afternoon, colleagues, everyone. I'm Ayanda Ndlekyana from Mistra. My question is based on Mr. De Beer or Prof. De Beer, I'm not entirely sure. During the National Development Plan, sector education and training authorities and YES programs were implemented. Does Stats SA have a data set that checks the conversion rates of interns going into permanent employment or the cycle of the employment trap? Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Short and sharp. So we have 2 questions in the front or further forward, or maybe 3. I'll take those 3 questions and then maybe we can do a round of answers.
Hi everybody, my name is Gracious. I'm a PhD student at Stellenbosch and I'm studying South to South migration, economic insecurity and the politics of immigrant exclusion. I would just like to understand how we are accounting for the international migrant population in our measurement of the informal sector. And the reason I'm asking this is because in my previous employment, I was working on a study investigating why the use of cash persists in township. And one of the insights was that the informal business owners themselves only accepted cash. And the reason for that was that a lot of the business owners were undocumented immigrants and therefore did not have documents to open bank accounts. So how are we measuring this, and could we be undercounting by excluding this portion of the population? I'd actually like to propose that as a major data gap in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 more ladies on the table. Yeah.
Good day. My name is Samantha Nabete. I am doing an honors in economics at the Nelson Mandela University. So my question is, South Africa's high unemployment limits expansion of the formal tax base as millions are not in stable formal work, right? So therefore cannot be included in the personal income tax base in the short run. So is South Africa's personal income tax system approaching a revenue ceiling due to its narrow base tax? And how does that affect the sustainability of the personal income tax?
Great question. And I think we got the last one.
Good day, colleagues and fellow students. My name is Pushia Tsikang. I'm studying Masters in Economics with UNISA. My question or comment goes to Memamiki regarding pay as you earn. According to your data and evidence, it shows that SARS collects most of their tax or income from the pay as you earn. But I feel like the brackets for pay as you earn, it's too high, especially for high income earners, right? So now it ends up reducing their take home disposable income. As a result, it also reduces their purchasing power, and it can also discourage workers, because now you are earning more, but due to the high tax brackets, your income is reduced. Thank you.
Okay, panel. Shall we? I don't see any. Oh, Vusi, maybe I check for you with you if there are any questions online.
Sure. So we have 2 questions that I can give to you for now, and a comment.
Yep.
The first question comes from Xoliswa Zakufa to Stats SA, that why don't we have statistics on work structure, i.e. internship or contracts, in brackets temporary versus permanent, which is more sustainable work for better analysis on labor markets. And then Ntombikai Gijana is asking a question, says, is the ILO unemployed and not looking term reflect the reality of South Africa's, or it's talking of students, retired and stay-at-home parents? It's confusing. And the comment, of course, from again, Ntombikai is saying, Prof V, is presenting interesting concepts from the longitudinal data. It underscores the important topics on precarious workers in South Africa's infrastructure sector, this being a comment from Ntombigaise Gijana.
Vusi, can I ask you to repeat the second question? I don't think I caught it.
It's a bit worded somehow, even it has an edited bracket at the end. But
Make an interpretation.
so I think she's trying to figure out really that the way ILO defines unemployment and not looking is not reflecting the realities in South Africa. Or maybe she's trying to figure out whether is it talking about students, retired employees, or is it talking about stay-at-home parents, the way they are defining they are unemployed and not looking unemployed and not looking population.
Okay, I got it. Tax incentives, interns versus permanent. So there are kind of two questions on that. South-South migration, what are we doing? Or what are we capturing in terms of international migration? Tax and demographics, what can we expect? Have we reached the ceiling for revenue? Pay as you earn, bracket creep, bunching at revenue or thresholds, if you want, work structure, ILO definitions or international definitions, and a heads up to, or a high five to Prof. Ranchhod on the precarious work. Mamiki, shall we start with you?
No.
No? Okay.
Sorry.
Enough.
I'm just sorting out my paperwork, but okay, let's start with some of the questions. We can always do a quick, so ETI, I thought maybe I could just share with you on page 175 of our publication. It gives you a sense of who of the employers are making use of ETI. And you'll see that, and also over time, how that ETI has grown. And we have seen a lot of employers making use of ETI as an instrument that allows them to bring in and employ the employees in the young category or youth category. And they would obviously get that as an incentive. And you see that's mostly, it's in the retail sector. That's the big employers that are making use of our ETI as well as the services sector. So it does help in terms of giving an incentive to employers who otherwise would not have considered bringing additional staff members just so that they can give them the opportunity to work. So to the question around, has it expanded? Yes, it has expanded, and we can see the sectors that are making use of the incentive. The high unemployment, the tax base, are we possibly reaching the ceiling? And maybe I'll combine Smeka's question with Portia's question. I think they're asking if we're taxing individuals too much, and I would imagine in your courses you probably would have read and studied a phenomenon called the Laffer curve. We do, as SARS, we do our policy teams, our legal policy teams do work hand in hand with the National Treasury team to make sure that we do not tax beyond and above what the taxpayers can handle. So there are different instruments, there are different variations of how to increase your revenue collections without necessarily increasing the, let's call it the maximum marginal tax rates, and. So there are a couple of things that the policymakers, the legislative teams, supported by our legislative team in SARS, that consider what is the best option. And of course, it is based on data. We do look at historical data. The earlier comment that was made by the DG around the increase of the rate from 41, the maximum marginal tax rates from 41 to 45%, and the impact that we saw, it's a clear indication of that, you know, the more we start relying on evidence as opposed to being under, let's call it fiscal pressure, it helps us to make the right decisions. And in the last 2 or 3 years, you would have seen that we've taken a different policy stance around how to collect more revenue in PIT without increasing the maximum marginal tax rates. Yeah, I think
that's you. I think
yeah, I think the only other point I would have made around the contribution of PIT, there was a comment around why is PIT the biggest contributor to our overall revenue collections. If you take, so one of the other publications that I wanted to mention was the tax chronology publication by the Reserve Bank. If you look at that data, going as far back as 1980, at some stage in South Africa's fiscal history, CIT used to be the biggest contributor of overall revenue. So corporate income taxes used to be the biggest contributor, but we have made certain decisions. There was a commission of, a CATS tax commission, followed by the Davis Tax Commission, thank you. And that pointed to the kind of taxation system that we wanted as South Africa. So we did make specific policy interventions to move us from, like I said, if you look at our data, historical data, we used to be quite dependent on CIT, and that has shifted over time to PIT being the biggest contributor, followed by VAT, followed by CIT. It is a policy decision that we took as a country.
Thanks, Mamiki. Professor Ranchhod, I think, is your mic?
Thanks. Sorry. So I just talked to a few of the things. The ETI one, it's something which a few years ago I was on a panel with Andrew Donaldson and Josh Budlander, who's a researcher in SALDRU and a co-author of Amina's, and myself. And we were all talking about this. And it was really funny because we all know the same papers, but we had 3 different evaluations of the literature. So I guess the only thing we can say is it's an ongoing debate. What's the full effects of the law, of the program? The point about banking and stuff, that one it's an interesting one because it's an easy one to fix. Like people could get bank accounts, right? Like when I studied abroad, you can get it the same day. There's really no issue. And it's really hard to see why, especially if you're thinking of small-scale traders, why they would not be allowed to have it. And also, like if you think of the stuff Harun talked about earlier about crime and barriers and things like that. So, but it's a political question. It's not an economic question, really. The infrastructure can handle it. In terms of surveys, our surveys don't discriminate by nationality. It's not as if we go to someone's house and say, where are you from? And, oh, okay, we don't want to talk to you, right? It is true that certain subgroups who feel maybe threatened are less likely to participate because everyone has the right to say they don't want to participate. But that's not the same. It's not as if we intentionally exclude people from surveys. Now, if you're thinking of a cross-country survey, that's far more ambitious and complex in terms of costs and in terms of logistics. I only know of one in the world of that sort. Yeah, that's all.
Thanks. And then Mr. De Beer.
Yeah, let me try. Thanks for the questions. You might not like the answers, though, but let me give them to you in any case. From Mistra, we do not track the conversion rate of interns into permanent employment. But I think that also gives me an opportunity to mention that even though Stats SA produces official statistics, we are just one of the partners in something called the South African National Statistics System. So we shouldn't think that all the data should come from Stats SA. We have a specific remit or scope of data that we want to publish. So if there's conversion rates that one wants to link to the funding giving to the different SETAs, that is typically information that one should try to gather from the SETAs themselves rather than thinking everything should come from a survey. It will make our sample surveys horrendously expensive if we wanted to be representative to try to measure something like that. So short answer is we do not track that. Also want to just add on to the third question about the unsolicited or undocumented immigrants. You know, when we do household surveys, we, at some occasion, like in the population census, you might ask about country of birth or something like that. But if you think for yourself, if you in the QLFS had to sample somebody that is undocumented, they will not tell you that. So there's no value in asking questions if you're not going to have a realistic chance of publishing the answer to the question. People might say where I was born, and we're not an institution. When we ask people, we tell them, please prove your answer. We will just ask you where you were born if that's the case of the survey, but we're not going to ask people to confirm that with birth certificates or something like that. So that's not a type of statistic that you will typically get from a statistics office. There was also the online question about the definitions from the ILO. I also sort of had to think twice about the question, but not everybody that is unemployed necessarily wants to work. So the definition of the unemployment from the ILO that we follows covers people that, as per that diagram that we try to unpack it, meets the criteria as we went from the employed, unemployed, or not in the labor force, those 3 steps that we try to illustrate. And some examples could be, I could be in my 30s, I could be qualified, I could be offered jobs, but I choose not to take the job. I choose to be unemployed. Why? Maybe I don't need a job at this stage in my life, or I'm focusing on something else. So we shouldn't think that that all unemployed people are because they can't find a job. There is a natural unemployment rate as well in the economy. I think those covers the questions that I had something to say on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions and responses, and online as well. So maybe I tell a personal story, and maybe we relate this to the discussion where I met some of the students last night, and also going into the discussion we're going to have tomorrow. So I actually have had the pleasure of using all of the data sets that have been presented today. So in my master's, I actually used the NIDS data set to look at what old age pension grants do for unemployed workers. So how does it help them or not? And then in my doctoral thesis, I actually used the QLFS data, harmonized in the PALMS data, as well as the SARS data, tax administrative data, to unpack some questions that we had around the employment tax incentive. So for those of you who are looking for data for your thesis, for your research projects, your presentations here today should now be giving you some ideas on what actually to do. Then tomorrow, we are going to unpack a little bit more about active labor market policies. I think it's session 5. So there's going to be a presentation about various active labor market policies, and there are going to be some additional presentations around some of the research that's been done using some of the excellent data to answer some of those questions, and then perhaps some of the gaps that exist from there. So maybe to bring this all together, I started off with saying kind of public economics begins with evidence. Good policy depends on measuring those outcomes accurately, and understanding how people actually move through the labor market and how public interventions or government interventions can actually change those trajectories. So investing in high quality data, so that was my thought process. So if we put more money and we think about those data gaps, we add to the already rich body of evidence that we have and ultimately invest in better public policy. Thank you so much. Back to you, Vusi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ebrahim and the panel. Miki and the panel, you may... yeah, I think this is where it ends, right? You are standing between people and lunch, so they'd like to have a stay at you for one more time. And with that, please give them a round of applause as they leave the stage. Thank you.